August 23, 2022, Lake Michigan, approximately 47 miles northwest of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The water at this location reaches depths of over 300 feet, cold and dark even in summer, a place where visibility drops to near zero beyond the reach of sunlight. This is one of the deepest sections of the lake, an area that has claimed vessels and aircraft for over a century, holding their remains in frigid silence. The Great Lakes Exploration Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to locating and documenting historical shipwrecks and lost aircraft, had been conducting a systematic survey of Lake Michigan throughout the summer of 2022. Using advanced remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras and sonar mapping technology, the team was searching for World War II-era aircraft known to have been lost during training operations. Between 1941 and 1945, Lake Michigan served as a crucial training ground for the United States military. The vast expanse of water, far from combat zones but large enough to simulate ocean conditions, provided an ideal location for pilot training, aircraft carrier qualification, and navigation exercises. Thousands of pilots trained over these waters, and not all of them made it back to shore. Historical records suggested that over 100 aircraft went down in Lake Michigan during the war years. Some were recovered at the time. Many were not. The cold, deep waters of the lake preserved these aircraft in remarkable condition, far better than saltwater or land environments would have. But finding them required modern technology that simply hadn't existed in the 1940s. On August 23rd, the exploration team was investigating a sonar anomaly detected 3 days earlier during a mapping run. The anomaly sat at a depth of 320 feet, in an area where no known wrecks had been recorded. The sonar signature suggested something large, metallic, and intact on the lake bottom. Team leader Christopher Jones deployed the ROV at approximately 10 a.m. The remotely operated vehicle descended through increasingly dark water, its lights piercing the gloom as it approached the target depth. At 315 feet, the cameras captured the first images, and what they showed made Christopher's breath catch. Sitting upright on the lake bottom, as if it had simply landed there and decided to stay, was a North American B-25 Mitchell bomber. The twin-engine medium bomber was recognizable immediately by its distinctive profile: twin-tail fins, high-mounted wings, and the glazed nose section that housed the bombardier position. But this bomber wasn't configured for combat. The nose was modified for training, and the aircraft bore markings consistent with stateside operations. The bomber was in extraordinary condition. 80 years underwater should have reduced it to unrecognizable wreckage. But Lake Michigan's cold, fresh water and the depth, which meant less wave action and disturbance, had preserved the aircraft almost perfectly. The fuselage was intact. The wings were attached. The landing gear was retracted. Marine growth covered every surface in a ghostly patina of algae and calcium deposits, but beneath it all, the structure remained solid. As Christopher maneuvered the ROV closer to examine the cockpit, the cameras revealed something that transformed this from a historical discovery into something far more profound and haunting. Through the canopy opening, the plexiglass long since deteriorated or blown away, the interior of the cockpit was visible in the ROV's powerful lights cutting through the blue-green water. Two figures sat in the pilot and co-pilot positions. Skeletal remains, completely preserved by the cold water, still occupied their original seats exactly as they had 80 years ago. But what made the scene particularly haunting was how perfectly preserved the moment of death had been. Both skeletons still wore their leather flight helmets, the distinctive aviator headgear now covered with a thin layer of sediment and algae, but still recognizable, still strapped to the skulls beneath them. The skeletal hands of both pilots were still positioned on the controls. The pilot's bony fingers gripped the control yoke, frozen in the act of flying. The co-pilot's hands were similarly positioned, one on his control yoke, the other near the throttle quadrant. They hadn't abandoned their aircraft. They hadn't tried to escape. They'd stayed at their posts, attempting to control the bomber until the very end. Their harnesses were still fastened across the skeletal torsos. The fabric had deteriorated, but the metal buckles and fittings remained intact, holding the remains in their seats. The uniforms, leather flight jackets over military shirts, were recognizable despite 80 years of deterioration. The leather had survived better than cotton or wool, protected by the cold water and lack of oxygen. Patches, insignia, and name tags were still visible, though obscured by marine growth. The entire scene was illuminated by the ROV's lights, cutting through water filled with suspended particles that created an otherworldly effect, like snow falling in slow motion through the blue-green gloom. Algae and aquatic vegetation had grown over every surface inside the cockpit, creating a garden of the depths. The instrument panel behind the pilots was covered in thick incrustations of calcium and marine organisms, the dials and gauges buried beneath decades of underwater accumulation. It was a tomb frozen in time, a moment of tragedy preserved perfectly for 8 decades. Two young men who'd been flying a routine training mission and who now sat in eternal silence 320 feet beneath the surface, their hands still on the controls, their bodies still strapped into their seats, waiting 80 years to be discovered. Christopher immediately marked the location and contacted his supervisor and the project's historical consultant. By that afternoon, protocols were being established for how to proceed. This was no longer just an aircraft wreck. This was a war grave containing the remains of American service members, preserved in a way that was both scientifically remarkable and deeply sobering. Over the next several days, the ROV made multiple dives to thoroughly document the bomber and its occupants. The video and still images captured showed the interior of the cockpit in remarkable detail. Every instrument, every control, every piece of equipment was documented. And most importantly, the two figures who'd remained at their posts were photographed from every angle with the respect appropriate for fallen warriors. The bomber's bureau number, the military's identification code painted on the fuselage, was partially visible beneath the marine growth. Using careful ROV maneuvering and image enhancement technology, the number was eventually captured clearly enough to cross-reference with World War II records. The number led investigators to a specific aircraft, a B-25 Mitchell assigned to Naval Air Station Glenview in Illinois in 1942, and from there to a mission that never returned, and 2 pilots who'd been listed as missing in action for 80 years. Before we continue with this story, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on October 23, 1942, involves 2 skilled bomber pilots, a routine training mission that went tragically wrong, and a mystery that lasted 8 decades. By the end, you'll understand how 2 young aviators were lost to Lake Michigan's depths and why it took 80 years to bring them home. The questions that investigators faced were profound. What happened during that training flight? How did an experienced crew end up at the bottom of the lake? And what could be learned from 2 men who'd remained at their posts for 80 years beneath the waves? Captain Michael Roberts was 27 years old in October 1942, an experienced bomber pilot and flight instructor assigned to Naval Air Station Glenview. He stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, with a solid, muscular build developed from years of physical training and military service. His hair was sandy brown, his eyes hazel. He had a distinctive scar on his left hand from a propeller accident during his early training days, a reminder of the dangers inherent in aviation, even on the ground. Michael had been born in 1915 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, growing up in a working-class family. His father worked in furniture manufacturing, the dominant industry in Grand Rapids at that time. Michael had been fascinated by aviation from childhood, building model airplanes with meticulous care and following the exploits of famous aviators in newspapers and magazines. After graduating high school in 1933, during the depths of the Depression, he'd worked odd jobs and saved every dollar he could, eventually earning enough to take flight lessons at a local airfield. By 1938, Michael had earned his commercial pilot's license and was working as a flight instructor, teaching civilians to fly at a small airport outside Grand Rapids. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, Michael recognized that American involvement was increasingly likely. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps in 1940, determined to serve his country and fly military aircraft in what he believed would be the defining conflict of his generation. Michael's training record was exemplary. He qualified on single-engine fighters first, demonstrating natural aptitude and exceptional spatial awareness. He then transitioned to multi-engine bombers, where his ability to manage complex systems and lead a crew became evident. By 1941, he was flying B-25 Mitchells and was recognized as one of the most skilled bomber pilots in his squadron. His superiors noted his calm demeanor under pressure, his technical proficiency, and his ability to make sound decisions quickly. Instead of being sent to combat theaters, Michael was retained stateside as an instructor, a decision that frustrated him initially. He wanted to fight, wanted to take the war to the enemy. But his commanding officers explained that his skills were more valuable teaching the next generation of bomber pilots. Every student he trained successfully might save lives in combat. Every crew he prepared properly increased the chances of mission success and survival. Michael came to accept this as his contribution to the war effort, though he never stopped requesting transfer to a combat unit. As an instructor, Michael was patient, thorough, and demanding. He pushed his students hard because he knew their lives might depend on the skills he taught them. He'd seen too many accidents caused by inadequate training or pilot overconfidence. He believed in drilling procedures until they became automatic, in teaching pilots to respect their aircraft and the environment they flew in, and in never accepting anything less than excellence from those under his instruction. Michael had married Catherine Wilson in 1939, before the war. They had a daughter, Elizabeth, born in 1941, and Catherine was pregnant with their second child in October 1942. Michael carried a photograph of Catherine and Elizabeth in his flight jacket, looking at it before every mission for luck. He wrote to Catherine almost daily, telling her about his students' progress, expressing how much he missed her and their daughter, and talking about the future they would build after the war. He dreamed of buying a small airport where he could teach flying to the next generation in peacetime. By October 1942, Michael had logged over 2,000 flight hours and had trained dozens of bomber crews, many of whom had gone on to serve with distinction in combat theaters. He was considered one of the best instructors at Naval Air Station Glenview, known for his technical knowledge, his calm professionalism, and his genuine care for his students' development and safety. Lieutenant David Miller was 24 years old in October 1942, a young pilot undergoing advanced bomber training at Naval Air Station Glenview. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, with an athletic build. His hair was dark brown, his eyes blue. He had the clean-cut appearance typical of military aviators of that era, and those who knew him described his expression as earnest and focused, always paying attention, always learning. David had been born in 1918 in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the son of a small business owner who ran a hardware store. Growing up in a Midwest town during the Depression had taught David the value of hard work and perseverance. He'd excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, and had been accepted to Iowa State University in 1936 with plans to study engineering. David's interest in aviation had developed during his college years. He'd taken his first flight in 1937, going up with a barnstormer who was passing through Cedar Rapids. That single flight had changed his trajectory. He'd continued his engineering studies, but spent every spare moment at the local airfield, eventually working part-time as ground crew in exchange for flight lessons. By the time he graduated from Iowa State in 1940 with a degree in mechanical engineering, David had earned his private pilot's license. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, David enlisted immediately. His engineering background and existing flight experience made him an ideal candidate for pilot training. He entered the Army Air Corps flight training program in January 1942. David's training progression had been steady and successful. He'd completed primary training, basic training, and advanced single-engine training with good marks. His instructors noted that he was methodical, careful, and showed excellent understanding of aircraft systems. His engineering background was evident in how he approached flying. In summer of 1942, he'd been selected for multi-engine transition training, learning to fly bombers rather than fighters. The B-25 Mitchell was a complex aircraft for its time. Twin engines, retractable landing gear, multiple crew positions, sophisticated systems. It required a different skill set than single-engine aircraft. David had taken to bomber flying naturally, his systematic approach and technical knowledge serving him well. By October 1942, he'd logged approximately 400 hours total time, with about 80 hours in the Prob. B-25. David was scheduled to complete his advanced bomber training in November 1942, after which he would receive his assignment, most likely to a combat unit preparing to deploy overseas. He wrote letters home to his parents weekly, telling them about his training, expressing confidence in his abilities, and assuring them that he was being well prepared for whatever lay ahead. Those who flew with David described him as competent, careful, and eager to learn. He asked good questions, paid attention to details, and took his training seriously. He understood that the skills he was learning now might mean the difference between life and death once he reached a combat theater. He had a quiet determination about him, a focus that impressed his instructors. Captain Michael Roberts had been assigned as David Miller's supervising instructor for his final phase of B-25 training. Over the previous 2 weeks, they'd flown together multiple times, conducting various training exercises designed to prepare David for the demands of operational flying. Michael's evaluation reports on David were positive. He noted that David had good hands, meaning he controlled the aircraft smoothly and precisely. He noted that David's technical understanding was excellent, and he noted that David showed good judgment and situational awareness. The relationship between instructor and student in military aviation is unique. The instructor holds the student's life in his hands, literally every time they fly. The student must trust the instructor completely. Michael took this responsibility seriously, treating every student with respect while maintaining the high standards necessary to produce combat-ready pilots. On October 23, 1942, Michael and David were scheduled for a navigation training mission over Lake Michigan. David would fly as pilot in command under Michael's supervision, practicing instrument navigation, radio procedures, and flight planning execution. It was the kind of mission David had flown several times before, and one that Michael had supervised hundreds of times. Neither had any reason to believe this flight would be different from any other. Neither could have known they were about to embark on a journey that would last 80 years. October 23, 1942. A Friday afternoon at Naval Air Station Glenview, Illinois, located approximately 15 miles north of Chicago on the Lake Michigan shoreline. The weather that morning had been clear and cool, typical for late October in the Midwest. Temperature at 7 a.m. was 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds were light from the northwest at 8 to 10 miles per hour. Visibility was reported as 10 miles or greater. Conditions were rated as good for flight operations. The B-25 Mitchell bomber designated for the afternoon training mission had been pre-flighted that morning by ground crew. The aircraft, bureau number 43792, was a standard B-25C model configured for training operations. Maintenance records showed the aircraft was in excellent condition, with no mechanical discrepancies noted. Fuel tanks were topped off. All systems were checked and operational. Captain Michael Roberts and Lieutenant David Miller arrived at the flight line at approximately 1:15 p.m. for a mission briefed to begin at 2 p.m. The training flight was a navigation exercise, a planned route that would take them north over Lake Michigan, following a course parallel to the Wisconsin shoreline, then returning south to Glenview. Total planned flight time was approximately 2.5 hours. The route kept them within 50 miles of shore at all times, well within range of navigation aids and radio communication. The weather briefing at 1:30 p.m. showed conditions remained favorable, though a weather system approaching from the west was expected to bring increasing clouds and possible fog to the area by evening. The forecaster noted that conditions over the lake might deteriorate faster than over land due to the temperature differential between the water and the air. Michael and David were advised to monitor weather conditions closely and return early if visibility decreased significantly. At 1:50 p.m., Michael and David completed their pre-flight inspection of the aircraft. David, as pilot in command for this training mission, conducted the exterior inspection while Michael observed and checked his technique. Everything appeared normal. The aircraft was ready. At 2:05 p.m., they started engines. At 2:12 p.m., they received taxi clearance. At 2:15 p.m., they were cleared for takeoff from Glenview's main runway. Witnesses on the ground watched the B-25 lift off smoothly, climb to the north, and disappear into the afternoon sky. The takeoff was routine, professional, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced instructor and a well-trained student. There was nothing to suggest that anything was wrong or would go wrong. At 2:23 p.m., David radioed Glenview Tower reporting they were level at 5,000 feet, heading north over the lake as planned. His voice was calm, professional, mimicking the radio technique he'd been taught. He reported weather conditions as clear, with excellent visibility. He confirmed they were proceeding with the planned route. At 2:47 p.m., David made another routine position report indicating they were approximately 35 miles north of Glenview, still at 5,000 feet, conditions still good. Michael was likely monitoring David's performance, evaluating his radio technique and navigation accuracy. This was the last transmission that was clearly understood. At 3:12 p.m., Glenview Tower attempted to contact the B-25 for a scheduled position report. There was no response. The tower called 3 more times over the next 5 minutes. No response. At 3:21 p.m., another aircraft in the area, a Navy trainer conducting separate operations, reported that weather conditions over the northern lake were deteriorating rapidly. A fog bank was moving in from the west, reducing visibility dramatically. The trainer reported diverting back to shore to avoid the weather. At 3:34 p.m., Glenview Tower received a broken, static-filled transmission that might have been from Michael and David's aircraft. The transmission was too degraded to understand clearly, but the voice, possibly Michael's, might have said something about visibility or returning to base. No further transmissions were received despite repeated attempts to establish contact. At 3:47 p.m., what would be the last confirmed transmission from the B-25 was received. The message was fragmentary, interrupted by static. Reducing altitude. Attempting to maintain visual reference. Visibility near zero. The voice was tense, but controlled. Likely Michael's, as he would have taken command when conditions became critical. The transmission cut off abruptly. All subsequent calls went unanswered. At 4:15 p.m., with the aircraft now 45 minutes overdue for a position report and with no radio contact for over an hour, Glenview Tower declared an emergency. Search and rescue protocols were activated immediately. But by 4:15 p.m., the weather over the lake had deteriorated severely. The fog bank that had been approaching from the west had moved across the entire northern section of Lake Michigan. Visibility over the water was near zero. Surface winds had increased to 20 miles per hour with gusts to 30. Waves were building to 6 to 8 feet. The conditions that had trapped Michael and David were now preventing anyone from searching for them. Throughout Friday evening and into Saturday morning, search aircraft attempted to locate the missing B-25, but fog and low clouds severely limited their effectiveness. Pilots could barely see the water surface, let alone spot wreckage or debris. Coast Guard vessels searched the area where the aircraft was believed to have gone down, but in the fog and growing seas, they found nothing. By Saturday afternoon, October 24th, the weather began to clear. Search operations intensified. Multiple aircraft crisscrossed the northern lake, searching for any sign of wreckage, debris, oil slicks, anything that might indicate where the bomber had gone down. Coast Guard vessels conducted surface searches. Nothing was found. Sunday, October 25th, brought better weather and even more intensive search operations. The area being searched expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of lake. Still, searchers found nothing. No wreckage, no debris, no oil slick, no bodies. The lake had simply swallowed the B-25 and its crew without leaving a trace. The investigation into the disappearance of Captain Michael Roberts and Lieutenant David Miller began immediately and quickly, became one of the most thorough aircraft accident investigations conducted up to that point in the war. Military authorities, desperate to understand what had happened and to prevent similar losses, examined every aspect of the mission. The aircraft's maintenance records were scrutinized line by line. Bureau number 43792 had been well maintained, with no history of mechanical problems. The last major inspection had been completed just 5 days before the mission. Ground crew who'd worked on the aircraft were interviewed extensively. None reported any issues or concerns. The aircraft had been airworthy. Michael Roberts's flight record was examined. Over 2,000 flight hours, exemplary safety record, extensive experience in the B-25, current on all certifications and qualifications. Medical records showed he was in excellent health. His performance evaluations were outstanding. There was no indication of any physical or mental condition that might have contributed to the accident. David Miller's record was similarly reviewed. His training progression had been normal and successful. His flight evaluations were good. His medical examination from 1 month earlier showed perfect health. His recent training flights with Michael had gone smoothly, with Michael praising David's developing abilities in multiple reports. There was no indication that David lacked the skills necessary for the mission he'd been conducting. The weather was examined in exhaustive detail. The fog that had moved in Friday afternoon had been forecast, but had arrived faster and more intensely than predicted. Meteorologists explained that conditions over large bodies of water could change with frightening rapidity, much faster than over land. The temperature differential between the relatively warm water and the cooling autumn air had created perfect conditions for dense fog formation. Once that fog formed, visibility could drop from 10 miles to less than a quarter mile within minutes. The radio transmissions were analyzed. The final fragmentary message suggested the crew had recognized the danger and were attempting to descend to maintain visual reference with the water surface, a standard procedure when caught in deteriorating visibility conditions while flying under visual flight rules. But in dense fog over water, maintaining spatial orientation is extremely difficult. Without being able to see the horizon or the surface clearly, even experienced pilots can become disoriented within seconds. Investigators developed a working theory of what had happened. Michael and David had been flying their planned route when they encountered the rapidly forming fog. Visibility decreased faster than they could react. They attempted to descend to stay below the fog layer and maintain visual contact with the water, standard procedure for VFR flight encountering instrument conditions. But in dense fog over water, with no visual reference points, the situation deteriorated quickly. The investigators theorized that one of several scenarios might have occurred. The aircraft might have descended too quickly while attempting to stay below the fog, striking the water at speed before the crew realized how low they were. The pilots might have become spatially disoriented in the fog, entering an unusual attitude without recognizing it until too late. They might have attempted an emergency, landing on the water, misjudging their height above the surface in the zero visibility conditions. Without wreckage, without witnesses, without bodies, the investigation could only theorize. The official accident report, completed in December 1942, listed the probable cause as controlled flight into terrain, water, due to spatial disorientation in instrument meteorological conditions. The report noted that both pilots were qualified and that the instructor pilot was highly experienced. It noted that the aircraft was airworthy. It noted that the weather conditions had been unexpectedly severe. No fault was assigned to either pilot. Their deaths were classified as in the line of duty. On November 15, 1942, Michael Roberts' wife, Catherine, was notified that her husband was officially listed as missing in action, presumed deceased. She was 26 years old with a 2-year-old daughter and 7 months pregnant with their second child. The late military provided death benefits, but Catherine would spend the rest of her life wondering what had happened to her husband, where he was, whether he'd suffered. David Miller's parents, Robert and Helen Miller, were similarly notified. Their son, their only child, was gone. The son who'd been so focused and determined, who'd worked so hard to become a pilot, had disappeared over the lake on a routine training mission. They held a memorial service on December 10, 1942, but there was no body to bury, no grave to visit, just an empty space where their son had been. In May 1943, both Michael and David were honored with memorial markers at a ceremony at Naval Air Station Glenview. Their names were added to the station's memorial wall listing personnel lost during training operations. Their official status remained missing in action, though everyone understood they were dead. The lake had claimed them, as it would claim dozens more aviators before the war ended. The B-25 Mitchell that had carried them to the bottom was never found, despite extensive searches. The lake was too deep, search technology was too primitive, and the exact location where the aircraft went down was unknown. Within weeks, the search was called off. Within months, the accident was largely forgotten as the war continued, and new tragedies demanded attention. Within years, Michael and David were remembered only by their families and a few fellow pilots who'd known them. The lake kept its secret. 320 feet beneath the surface, beyond the reach of any search technology available in 1942, the B-25 sat on the bottom, intact, its crew still at their posts. And there it would remain, silent and undisturbed, for 80 years. The 80 years between the disappearance of Michael Roberts and David Miller in October 1942 and the discovery of their bomber in August 2022 saw profound changes in the EEDU world, in aviation, in America itself. World War II ended in 1945. The men and women who'd served came home or were laid to rest. The aircraft that had been so vital to the war effort were either scrapped or retired. The massive military infrastructure that had trained thousands of aviators was gradually dismantled. Naval Air Station Glenview, where Michael and David had been based, continued operations through the Cold War. Generations of pilots trained there. But by the 1990s, military base closures led to Glenview's decommissioning. The runways where Michael and David had taken off on their final mission were eventually torn up and redeveloped. The base itself became a memory, preserved only in historical records and in the recollections of those who'd served there. Catherine Roberts, Michael's widow, never remarried. She raised her daughter Elizabeth and her son Robert. Born in March 1943, 6 months after Michael's disappearance, on her own. She worked as a teacher, providing for her children while carrying the grief of a husband lost without explanation or closure. She told her children about their father, about his love of flying and his dedication to service and his dreams for their future. But she couldn't tell them where he was, how he died, what his final moments had been like. Those questions haunted her until her death in 1998, at age 82. Robert and Helen Miller, David's parents, similarly, lived with unanswered questions. Their son had been so talented, so dedicated, with such a bright future ahead of him, and he disappeared without a trace on a routine training flight, his body never recovered, his fate uncertain beyond the certainty that he was gone. Robert Miller died in 1968. Helen lived until 1985. Neither ever learned what had happened to their son. By the early 21st century, the story of Michael Roberts and David Miller was remembered only by their descendants and by military historians who studied World War II training accidents. They were two names among thousands who'd died in service during that war, their individual stories largely forgotten as the generation that had known them passed away. The B-25 bomber itself, Bureau number 43792, existed only as an entry in old military documents, aircraft assignment records, accident reports, maintenance logs stored in archives. The physical aircraft was presumed destroyed on impact, its wreckage scattered across the lake bottom or buried in sediment, lost forever. But Lake Michigan had not destroyed the bomber. The lake had preserved it perfectly, creating an underwater time capsule that would wait 8 decades to be discovered. The Great Lakes are fresh water, which means they lack the corrosive salts that rapidly deteriorate metal in oceans. The deep sections of the lakes are cold year-round, typically 36 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit even in summer. This cold temperature slows decomposition and corrosion dramatically. The depth means less wave action, less movement, less physical damage to anything resting on the bottom. And the lakes are relatively low in dissolved oxygen compared to oceans, which further slows deterioration and decomposition. These factors make the Great Lakes exceptional at preserving shipwrecks and aircraft. Ships that sank 150 years ago can be found nearly intact, their wooden structures preserved, their metal components corroded but recognizable. Aircraft that crashed decades ago can look almost as they did the day they went down, frozen in time by the cold, dark water. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, technology for underwater exploration improved dramatically. Sonar systems became more sophisticated, capable of detecting small objects at great depths with remarkable precision. Remotely operated vehicles could reach depths impossible for human divers and remain submerged for extended periods. High-definition cameras could capture clear images in near-total darkness. GPS and computer mapping allowed systematic surveys of large areas that would have been impossible to search manually. By 2020, multiple organizations were using this technology to locate and document historical wrecks in the Great Lakes. The goal was partly historical preservation, partly educational. Finding and documenting these wrecks allowed historians to study them, to understand what had happened, and to properly memorialize those who'd died. The Great Lakes Exploration Project, founded in 2014, had made locating lost World War II aircraft a priority. Historical records indicated that over 100 aircraft had been lost in Lake Michigan alone during the war years. Most had never been found. The project's goal was to locate as many as possible, document them thoroughly and respectfully, and work with military authorities to identify them and potentially recover remains for proper burial. Between 2018 and 2022, the project had located 17 aircraft wrecks in Lake Michigan. Most were training aircraft, fighters and bombers that had crashed during routine operations. Some had been found in relatively shallow water where recreational divers could reach them. Others were in the deepest parts of the lake, beyond the reach of any human diver, accessible only to remotely operated vehicles. By summer 2022, the project was conducting a systematic survey of the northwestern section of Lake Michigan, an area where several aircraft were known to have been lost, but where searches in the 1940s had found nothing. Using side-scan sonar to create detailed maps of the lake bottom, the team was identifying anything that looked artificial or unusual for follow-up investigation with ROVs. August 20th, 2022. The Great Lakes Exploration. Project's research vessel was conducting a sonar mapping run approximately 47 miles northwest of Milwaukee, in water averaging 300 to 350 feet deep. The sonar operator, monitoring the continuous stream of data appearing on his screens, noticed an anomaly at 320 feet. A large object, roughly 50 feet long, sitting upright on a relatively flat section of lake bottom. The object's size and shape were consistent with a medium-sized aircraft. Its die position, upright rather than inverted or on its side, was unusual and intriguing. Most aircraft that crash into water impact with significant force and end up damaged, scattered, or in abnormal positions. This object appeared intact and properly oriented. The team marked the coordinates for follow-up investigation. On August 23rd, conditions were favorable for ROV deployment. Winds were light, water was relatively calm, visibility at the surface was excellent. At 10 a.m., team leader Christopher Jones deployed the ROV, sending it down through 320 feet of increasingly dark water toward the mysterious object. As the ROV descended, its lights illuminated particles suspended in the water, creating a surreal effect like descending through a snowstorm in slow motion. Temperature dropped steadily with depth. At 100 feet, the water was 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At 200 feet, 48 degrees. At 300 feet, it had dropped to 38 degrees, barely above freezing. This was the realm where things were preserved, where time slowed, where the lake kept its secrets. At 315 feet, 5 feet above the target, the ROV's cameras captured the first clear images. Christopher, watching the video feed on the surface, immediately recognized what they'd found: a B-25 Mitchell bomber. The distinctive twin-tail configuration was unmistakable, even through the veil of marine growth. The aircraft was sitting upright. On the lake bottom, landing gear retracted, as if it had simply descended through the water column and settled gently onto the bottom. The preservation was extraordinary and immediately apparent. 80 years underwater should have reduced the bomber to a corroded, unrecognizable hulk. But the cold, fresh water had been remarkably kind. The fuselage was intact, though covered with a layer of algae and calcium deposits that gave everything a ghostly, pale green patina. The wings were attached and showed minimal structural damage. The engines were still mounted. Even some paint was visible beneath the marine growth. Christopher maneuvered the ROV closer, examining the aircraft systematically and documenting everything with the high-definition cameras. The tail section bore markings that were still partially legible beneath the growth. The bureau number, painted on the fuselage, was obscured by sediment and algae, but portions were visible. Every angle, every detail was being recorded. As duty, Christopher brought the ROV around to examine the cockpit area. The cameras revealed what would transform this discovery from historically significant to profoundly moving and haunting. The bomber's canopy, the plexiglass covering that would have protected the cockpit, had long since deteriorated or been torn away, leaving the interior open to the water. And through that opening, illuminated by the ROV's powerful lights cutting through the blue-green water, the interior of the cockpit was fully visible. 2 figures sat in the pilot and co-pilot positions. The ROV's lights revealed them clearly. Skeletal remains, completely preserved, still occupying their original seats exactly as they had 80 years ago when the bomber went down. But what made the scene particularly haunting and deeply moving was the preservation of every detail, creating a frozen moment that told a story of duty and courage. Both skeletons still wore their leather flight helmets. The distinctive aviator headgear, designed to protect pilots and provide communication capability, was still strapped to the skulls beneath them. 80 years underwater had covered the leather with sediment and a thin layer of algae, but the helmets were completely recognizable, still maintaining their shape, still in place exactly as they'd been worn on that October afternoon in 1942. The skeletal hands of both pilots were still positioned on the controls, frozen in the act of flying. The pilot on the left, his bony fingers still gripped the control yoke, the U-shaped steering mechanism that controlled the bomber's attitude. His arms were in the position of someone actively flying, pulling or pushing on the controls. The co-pilot's skeletal hands were similarly positioned, one hand on his control yoke, the other reaching toward the throttle quadrant mounted between the seats. They hadn't released the controls. They hadn't given up. They'd stayed at their stations, fighting to control the aircraft until the very end. The harnesses that held them in their seats were still fastened across their skeletal torsos. The fabric webbing had deteriorated badly, but the metal buckles, fittings, and adjustment hardware remained intact and in place, still performing their function of keeping the pilots in their seats 8 decades after their deaths. The harnesses crossed over the rib cages, fastened at the center, locked in position. Neither pilot had attempted to unbuckle. Neither had tried to escape or abandon the aircraft. Their uniforms were recognizable despite the deterioration. The leather flight jackets that military aviators wore for warmth and protection had survived remarkably well in the cold water. Leather, treated and tanned, resisted decomposition better than fabric. The jackets still covered the upper bodies, though marine growth obscured many details. Beneath the jackets, the remains of military shirts were visible where the leather didn't cover. Cotton and wool that had deteriorated to ghostly fragments, but that maintained enough structure to show they'd once been there. On the left breast of each jacket, patches and insignia were still visible, though obscured by algae and sediment. Name tags, rank insignia, unit patches, all the identifiers that military personnel wore, were still present, waiting to be documented and decoded. The metal zippers and fasteners had survived perfectly, their brass or steel construction impervious to the cold water. Around the skeletal necks of both pilots hung their identification tags, the rectangular stainless steel dog tags that every military member wore. The chains had corroded to near invisibility, but the tags themselves remained, dangling against the rib cages, their embossed information preserved by the non-corrosive properties of stainless steel. The scene inside the cockpit created a tableau that was both scientifically fascinating and emotionally overwhelming. Every surface was covered with the pale green and white growth of freshwater marine organisms. Algae and aquatic vegetation had colonized every available space, creating an underwater garden that transformed the cockpit into something otherworldly. Stalks of vegetation grew from crevices and sprouted from surfaces, waving gently in the minimal current at this depth. The instrument panel behind and between the pilots was buried beneath thick incrustations of calcium deposits and marine growth. The dials, gauges, switches, and indicators that had once provided critical information to the crew were now obscured beneath decades of accumulation. But the panel structure was intact. The instruments were all present, the entire system preserved beneath its protective coating. The water itself created an atmosphere unlike anything on land. The ROV's lights cut through the blue-green liquid, illuminating countless suspended particles that drifted through the scene like snow falling in slow motion. The visibility was perhaps 20 to 30 feet in the ROV's lights, beyond which everything faded into darkness. The color palette was entirely blues and greens, the reds and yellows of normal daylight completely filtered out by the depth. It was a tomb frozen in time, a moment of tragedy preserved perfectly for 8 decades 320 feet beneath the surface. 2 young men who'd been flying a routine training mission on an October afternoon in 1942 now sat in eternal silence, their skeletal hands still on the OU controls, their bodies still strapped into their seats, their helmets still on their skulls, waiting 80 years to be discovered and brought home. Christopher immediately stopped the ROV's movement and carefully repositioned to capture comprehensive documentation of the scene. The respect appropriate for what was essentially a war grave guided every action. Over the next hour, the ROV captured hundreds of photographs and continuous video from every angle, documenting the aircraft, the cockpit, and the 2 figures who'd remained at their posts. The critical task was identifying the aircraft and, if possible, identifying the crew. The bureau number on the fuselage was photographed from multiple angles, under different lighting. Image enhancement software would later be used to read the number through the marine growth. But potentially more definitive were the dog tags visible on both figures. The ROV's cameras were positioned to capture the clearest possible images of the tags, knowing that the embossed text on stainless steel could potentially be read through careful image processing. Over the following days, the ROV made multiple dives to thoroughly document every aspect of the discovery. The team contacted military historians, the Department of Defense, POW, MIA Accounting Agency, and officials from the National Museum of Naval Aviation. Protocols were established for how to proceed with identification and potential recovery. Image specialists worked to enhance the IUG photographs of the dog tags and the bureau number. The embossing on stainless steel created shadows and highlights that could be enhanced through computer processing. The bureau number was decoded first, 43792. Cross-referencing this with World War II records identified the specific aircraft, a B-25 Mitchell assigned to Naval Air Station Glenview, lost on October 23, 1942, with 2 crew members never recovered. The dog tags required more careful processing, but gradually the embossed text became legible. The tag on the figure in the left seat, the pilot's position, read Roberts Michael J., with a service number, blood type O positive, and religious preference Protestant. The information matched exactly with military records for Captain Michael J. Roberts, instructor pilot, lost over Lake Michigan in October 1942. The tag on the figure in the right seat, the co-pilot's position, read Miller David R., with corresponding information matching records for Lieutenant David R. Miller, student pilot undergoing advanced training, lost on the same mission. After 80 years, Michael Roberts and David Miller had been found. They were exactly where they'd been when they died, at the controls of their aircraft, helmets on, harnesses fastened, hands on the controls, attempting to the very end to bring their bomber down safely. The discovery prompted extensive discussion among military authorities, the families of the EDE deceased, and the exploration team about what should be done. The bomber was officially a military aircraft gravesite, protected by federal law and international maritime conventions. Disturbing it without proper authorization was prohibited. But Michael and David's descendants, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who'd grown up knowing their ancestor had disappeared over Lake Michigan, wanted their remains recovered and properly buried with military honors. After consultation with the Department of Defense, Navy officials, descendant families, and maritime archaeologists, a decision was made. The remains would be recovered using remotely operated vehicles specifically designed for delicate archaeological work, but the aircraft itself would be left in place as a memorial. The bomber had become Michael and David's resting place for 80 years. It would remain there, documented and protected, marking the spot where 2 brave aviators had given their lives in service to their country. The recovery operation was conducted in October 2022, 80 years almost to the day after the deaths. A specialized team using advanced ROVs with manipulator arms carefully recovered the skeletal remains, the dog tags, the flight helmets, and portions of the uniforms. The operation took several days and was conducted with the reverence and care appropriate for fallen service members. At the depth of 320 feet, no human divers were involved. The recovery was performed entirely by robotic systems operated from the surface, guided by skilled technicians who treated the task as sacred duty. The forensic examination of the remains after 80 years underwater provided limited but significant information. Both sets of remains were incomplete, as would be expected after such an extended period. Many smaller bones, from hands, feet, and portions of the vertebrae, were missing, likely lost to water movement, sediment shifting, or the activities of small, aquatic organisms over the decades. What remained were primarily the larger, more robust bones, skulls, long bones from arms and legs, major portions of the pelvis and rib cage. Even these showed the effects of 80 years of immersion, with surfaces that were porous and fragile. The remains from the left seat were confirmed as male, approximately 25 to 30 years old at death based on bone development markers that survived, standing approximately 6 feet to 6 feet 2 inches tall, based on measurements of the remaining long bones. The remains matched physical descriptions in military records of Michael Roberts. The dog tags provided definitive identification. The remains from the right seat were confirmed as male, approximately 20 to 25 years old at death, standing approximately 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet tall. The remains matched physical descriptions of David Miller. Again, the dog tags provided definitive identification beyond any doubt. Determining exact cause of death after 80 years underwater was impossible. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, no fractures, no bullet holes, no cut marks. But soft tissue injuries, internal trauma from impact, or drowning would leave absolutely no traces on skeletal remains after 8 decades of immersion. The forensic report officially listed cause of death for both as undetermined, consistent with aircraft water impact. What could be determined from the position of the remains, the bituif, condition of the aircraft, and the circumstances of the loss was more informative about their final moments. The bomber had descended to the water relatively intact. The fuselage showed no signs of catastrophic in-flight structural failure. The wings remained attached. The engines were still properly mounted. This suggested the aircraft hadn't broken apart in flight, but had descended to the water surface as a complete, controllable machine. The landing gear was retracted, indicating the pilots hadn't attempted a planned water landing where gear would normally be left up to prevent the aircraft from flipping on contact. The flaps were in a cruise configuration. The control surfaces appeared to be in relatively neutral positions. All of this suggested the aircraft had been under at least partial control when it reached the water. The position of the bomber on the lake bottom, sitting upright, nose slightly down, in a relatively level attitude, suggested it had struck the water at a somewhat controlled angle rather than in a steep, uncontrolled dive or inverted crash. The impact would still have been severe and likely fatal. At any significant forward speed, hitting water is biomechanically similar to hitting concrete. But the aircraft had held together rather than disintegrating, which suggested impact forces, while fatal, weren't at the absolute extreme end of the spectrum. The most revealing detail was the position and condition of the remains. Both Michael and David were still in their seats, hands positioned on or near the controls, bodies held in place by their still-fastened harnesses, helmets still on their heads. They hadn't unbuckled. They hadn't attempted to evacuate the aircraft. They hadn't moved from their positions. They'd remained at their posts, flying the airplane, attempting to maintain control until the very moment of impact and beyond. Based on all available evidence, investigators and historians developed a reconstruction of the final minutes of the flight. Michael and David encountered rapidly forming fog while flying their planned route over Lake Michigan. Visibility decreased dramatically and unexpectedly, faster than they could react or divert to clear conditions. Following standard procedures for visual flight encountering instrument conditions, they attempted to descend below the fog layer to maintain visual reference with the water surface. But in dense fog over open water, with no visual horizon and no clear view of the surface, spatial disorientation set in quickly. The fragmentary radio transmissions received by Glenview Tower suggested they recognized they were in serious trouble and were attempting to maintain aircraft control while dealing with near-zero visibility. Michael, as the experienced instructor, had almost certainly taken primary control of the aircraft, with David assisting. Descending through the fog, probably disoriented despite their training and experience, possibly uncertain of their exact altitude and attitude, the bomber struck Lake Michigan. The impact was severe, sufficient to cause almost certainly instantaneous fatal injuries to both crew members from the rapid deceleration forces. The cold water of the lake in October would have been around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to incapacitate within minutes, even if someone survived the initial impact. The bomber flooded quickly through the open canopy area and other openings, sinking stern first based on the weight. Distribution. It descended through 320 feet of water and settled onto the bottom in the position it would maintain for 80 years. Michael and David, held in their seats by their harnesses, remained at their posts as the aircraft made its final descent. The mystery of what happened to Michael Roberts and David Miller was finally solved after 8 decades, though many specific details would remain forever unknowable. They hadn't been shot down. There was no combat over Lake Michigan. They hadn't suffered mechanical failure. The aircraft was intact and all systems appeared normal in the wreckage. They hadn't made a catastrophic procedural error. They'd been caught by weather conditions that changed faster than forecasted, had attempted to handle an emergency situation with the training and procedures they'd been taught, and had ultimately been overcome by circumstances that would have challenged even the most experienced pilots. Michael Roberts' son, Robert, who'd been born 6 months after his father's disappearance, and who'd grown up knowing his father only through photographs, letters, and his mother's stories, was 79 years old when the discovery was announced. For nearly 8 decades, the family had known Michael was gone, but hadn't known where he was or exactly what had happened. The discovery meant Robert could finally bury his father, could visit a grave, could have a physical place to remember and honor him. "I always knew he was out, there somewhere in that lake," Robert said in an interview. "Now we can finally bring him home where he belongs." David Miller's nephew James, David's brother's son, was 77 years old when the bomber was found. He'd been born after the war, growing up with stories of the uncle he'd never met, who'd disappeared during pilot training. "Our family never had closure," James said. "For 80 years, we didn't know exactly what happened or where he was. Now we know. He stayed at his post. He did his duty. That's who he was, and that's how we'll remember him." On November 11, 2022, Veterans Day, Michael Roberts and David Miller were buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Their families attended, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, some of whom had never known the men they were laying to rest, but all of whom understood the significance of finally bringing them home. Military representatives were present. A color guard performed the IE ceremony. 2 F-35 fighter jets flew overhead in missing man formation, one breaking away to symbolize the fallen. After 80 years separated by water and time, 2 aviators who'd given their lives in service to their country had finally come home. The B-25 Mitchell that had been their final resting place remains at the bottom of Lake Michigan, 320 feet down, protected as a military aircraft gravesite. The exact coordinates are not publicly disclosed to prevent unauthorized disturbance or artifact collection, but the bomber sits there still, in the cold, dark water, preserved by the same conditions that kept its crew intact for 8 decades. It serves as a memorial to Michael and David, and to all the aviators who died in training during World War II, giving their lives in preparation for a war they would never reach. What happened to Michael Roberts and David Miller on October 23, 1942, was not the result of negligence, incompetence, or preventable error. It was the result of young men doing inherently dangerous work in challenging conditions with the technology and training available at that time. Over 100 aircraft were lost in Lake Michigan during World War II training operations. Dozens of aviators died, most in their 20s, most never reaching combat, most never found. Michael and David were among the fortunate in one respect. They were eventually found. Their families received answers after 80 years. They received proper burial with military honors. Their service was fully acknowledged and respected. But 80 years is an almost incomprehensible length of time to wait for closure. 80 years of wondering, of questions without answers, of grief complicated by uncertainty. The discovery reminds us that the cost of war extends far beyond battlefields. It includes training accidents, equipment limitations, weather hazards, and the simple reality that flying was dangerous in 1942 and that learning to fly in wartime conditions was even more so. It includes young men doing vital but risky work far from any combat zone, serving their country in ways that didn't make newspaper headlines but were no less crucial to the war effort. It includes families who waited for news that never came, who grieved for loved ones whose bodies were never recovered, who lived with painful uncertainty for decades. Michael Roberts and David Miller were skilled aviators, dedicated professionals, and courageous individuals who served their country during its greatest crisis. They were also human beings who died far too young, whose lives were cut short by circumstances they couldn't control, who remained missing for 80 years while the world moved on without them, while the people who'd known them aged and died, while new generations were born who would never know them except as names and stories. Now they rest at Arlington National Cemetery, their service finally fully honored, their sacrifice finally completely acknowledged. The lake that held them for 8 decades has given them back. The mystery that haunted their families for generations has been solved. The 2 pilots who stayed at their controls, hands on the yoke, helmets on, harnesses fastened, fighting until the very end to bring their aircraft down safely. Those 2 men have finally come home. Rest in peace, Captain Michael Roberts and Lieutenant David Miller. Your training mission is complete. Your duty is fulfilled. After 80 years beneath the cold waters of Lake Michigan, sitting at your posts in the cockpit of your bomber, you have finally landed safely home.